Greetings and welcome back to another discussion. Today is going to be a bit different as my guest happens to be female, but don't be too shocked by that. It has happened on occasion, though rarely. And today we're going to be talking about a subject that you should be interested in, namely female behavior more broadly, female behavior in the context of female self-awareness, and also specifically the notion that Eastern European women, as my guest is an Eastern European woman, are somehow fundamentally different, and as a consequence are good picks for men looking to marry and have families. The idea being that Eastern European women are, of course, traditional, and they value traditional things, and in contrast to women in the West or even Western Europe, and this is a good idea. Now, my own view is that this is largely mythology. Women are women, and like all human beings, women are modulated by their environment, and their behavior is mediated by their surroundings. So I would say that, yes, Eastern European women behave differently. They come from a different environment, but by no means are they fundamentally different, despite what people claim. Hence why I think it's a myth. And before I hand over the podium to my guest, I would simply say that if you look at divorce statistics, the divorce rate are actually higher typically in Eastern Europe than they are in the West, for reasons we might get into, I guess. But it's by no means some paradise for a lonely man from the West. And this, what I think is sort of mythology or even propaganda, should really be discussed thoroughly and I think ultimately disputed and dispelled. So thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
This myth that Eastern European women are fundamentally different and that they're all sort of traditional women who want a traditional lifestyle, that can't at least uniformly be true. And given my observations of other people, other men who've interacted with them, this seems not to be the case. What are your thoughts on this?
I think at least in part it's true in that Eastern European women are more family oriented and that the family structure is more stable. The extended family is held closer and not at a distance, unlike Western European countries or Western countries in general. However, the similarities, the distinctions end there. While Eastern European women present themselves as more feminine in both appearance and behavior, inherently they possess qualities that are one might find in a Western woman. The trap, of course, is that Eastern European women hide those tendencies in an effort to attract a partner. And so, really, one has to look at the history of Eastern European countries to understand where exactly the problem with this myth lies. Now, although not all, many of those countries were under influence of Soviet Union and or communism within the past century. And as one would expect from such a society, it adopted an egalitarian view of men and women, that they're simply cogs in a large system, and while they had their own specific niches, they were ultimately equal. Now, with the fall of the Soviet Union and the country's attempt to recover their lost culture from centuries past, men and women have adopted, seemingly have returned to the traditional roles they occupied. Men are more assertive and perhaps more performative in their performative of their physical feats. Meanwhile, women are spend large portion of their time and money beautifying themselves and trying to attract the best partner possible. But the poison of egalitarianism, if you're willing to call it that, has not been fully extinguished. And that's really the issue with the myth of a traditional Eastern European woman. You may think that just because she looks pretty, that she will make a beautiful wife who will create you well-behaved children, who will cook you delicious meals, clean your apartment, and perform fellatio on command. But just like any other woman, she is going to be confrontational. She's going to test you, and perhaps even more so, because she expects a similar, just like she expects to be feminine, she expects you to be perhaps extremely masculine,
Right.
which a lot of Western men not ready for, or they have difficulty emulating.
Not only that, I'd imagine that most Westerners don't speak, say, Slavic languages, say specifically Russian, because that's, I guess you could say, lingua franca in Eastern Europe, at least many parts of it. So they're never really getting an authentic. They can't even if they come over and they know a little bit about the area. I would suspect that they're not really getting an authentic picture of the way these women are. As you pointed out, the women seem to be presenting an image, and if you don't, language is of course the portal to a culture. If you don't have access to that, who knows? You might be getting, ripped off even. And I mean, if you don't know, say Russian, and they could be talking behind your back in front of your face, and you're just smiling there like a dimwit. So
Yeah,
yeah,
that's true enough. And unfortunately, even if you do know the language and are sufficiently fluent in it, and you have some understanding of the culture, you're still going to be blindsided, because for the simple reason that you continue to be an outsider insofar as you are a foreigner, especially so if you admit you're a foreigner from a Western country, because this this expresses itself in the phenomena of a male bride. Western men are viewed as a ticket out of the hellhole that is Eastern Europe. Well, it may be a hellhole depending on the region. In It's a ticket to affluency, a better lifestyle, a more fancy lifestyle, and better opportunity for the woman herself and her children. So unless you lie and say you're from Balkans or a similarly, I guess not similarly average country in terms of wealth, you're going to be overwhelmingly courted by women who are gold diggers, who are seek to use you for your resources and your passport, really, to find their way out of the country they're born in.
right. I imagine circumstances in the post-Soviet Union are such that, and I've been in one or two post-Soviet Union countries. I think Ukraine comes to mind. It was quite the experience, to say the least. I remember an experience in Ukraine where, just to give the audience a sense of the lack of infrastructure, where I was at a bus stop and I was looking for the Times, and the person I was traveling with at the time. So we don't have that. People just, I guess, out of habit, try to determine when the bus is going to arrive. And in general, these former Soviet bloc countries are very grim. The people are quite dour, and just not very. It doesn't seem like a nice place to live. So I can certainly understand the motivation of why these women want to escape these places, because it's a grim existence.
Certainly. I mean, people make jokes about commie blocks and people squatting in tracksuits in neighborhoods, but the reality is that, depending on individual country, of course, Eastern European countries economically, culturally, and socially are deeply scarred by the existence of the Soviet Union. The alcoholism rates and suicide rates, divorce rates, as you mentioned, are extremely high. I think the country with the highest suicide rate is in fact Lithuania,
Yes, not just
which
in Europe, by the way, in the world. This year, Lithuania reached number one. Used to be number one in Europe, now it's in the world, actually. So,
that's right, and for a good reason. It's there's not many economic opportunities, and even though it's a dream of many women to stay at home and raise their children, they're not able to afford it. And going to a university is not just expected, but it's a necessity if you wish to maintain your existence. And although they don't learn liberal arts or gender studies as their Western counterparts would, they still are forced to adopt at least some idea of independence and perhaps a certain degree of forcefulness that may not be obvious at a glance, but eventually reveals itself.
Hmm. So, would you say then that the recommendation that Western men should seek out quote unquote traditional Eastern European as a solution to the problems that seem now endemic to the West, whether it's Western Europe or North America or elsewhere, this seems to be largely, as I pointed out in the beginning, a myth and a mirage. It's, on the one hand, understandable that these women in these circumstances want to get out of them, but it seems to be done almost fraudulently by claiming that there's some love bond there or what have you. And some of these guys I've seen observed are they just can't get past it. They don't even think of it. They're so desperate they'll just go for it anyway. And one thing to sort of tie it in general with the idea of looking for women abroad, one thing I've observed with a lot of these men is, without exception, when they take these women out of their, I guess you could say, home environment where they grew up and culture, etc., and bring them to the West, without exception, I've seen it. It's been a disaster. The women are very malleable, very, I guess, fluid in their behavior within limits, and when they arrive in a place like the United States or Canada, whether they're from Eastern Europe or in some cases Southeast Asia, they don't need a long time to sort of pick up on the patterns that other women are exhibiting and, well, essentially copy them. I'm curious about your thoughts about that.
I think it's not simply a matter of copying them. A woman that is imported, from another country into, say, United States, will have a difficult time adjusting due to the fact that she has lost all of her social support network. Now, she may still talk to her mom over the internet or her sisters, but as such, she would feel isolated. The solution to that isolation is to expose herself to other Western women. And if she does not have the language barrier, that's what she will do.
Mm.
However, it is not that Western women poison the Eastern European woman with with their egalitarian values. Egalitarian values are endemic, epidemic, you could say, in European countries in general, but Eastern Europe more so.
Because
So
of the
what?
history.
Because of the history and really the fact that to compensate for hyperfeminine for the hyperfemininity, they show you have to be hypermasculine, and you may have heard, or the viewers may have heard of cases of domestic violence being particularly high in Eastern European countries, particularly Russia. Now, and that is one of the expressions of that, and it's something that's not encouraged, but it's part of the greater culture. And so Western men who are even if, even if they are maybe red-pilled, are still raised to respect women, at least in their adolescence, may find that they are not able to combat the combative nature that their male bride attacks them with, and they
Mm.
may simply lose to her each time because they've been blindsided by the pretty exterior.
Or to use more uh, aspersive terms, yeah, they're not quote unquote man enough because they're not going through these rituals that are, I guess, expected of them.
Yeah, if you look at interviews of Eastern women and their attitudes towards dating, you'll find that Eastern European women expect first date, if not all dates, to be paid for. They expect to be brought flowers at every date. They expect to be giving lavish gifts. Whereas, I guess, to their marginal benefit, Western women are less demanding in that regard, though it depends of course, on the circumstances. And Western women have their own problems with entitlement, but they're not as overt and I guess they're not as stereotypical.
Well, my understanding has always been that women just universally like being wined and dined. It's just in the West, because of
E-
feminism and things, they don't want to admit it, so they're willing to tolerate, having to
Yeah,
pay split the bill, basically. Go Dutch.
exactly. Yeah, I think there was a study on the subject where women were surveyed on whether they like paying for the first date, and a lot of the times women will pay their part, but they will not like it, and they may only like it if the person they're with is particularly attractive.
Do you think in the Eastern European context that if that's the case, that the expectation is simply always there that the man foot the bill, that the
Yes,
transactional nature that would, I would assume, exist, that he might foot the bill, he'll pay for whatever, but he's going to be getting some sort of sexual access in exchange. Surely this has to be a part of it, otherwise they wouldn't go through the motions, I'd imagine.
yeah. While Eastern European women present themselves as soft and feminine and malleable, they view their appearance and your perception of their appearance as an asset, and your interactions as transactional. So if you are to enjoy the company of an Eastern European woman and not pay her in some respect, you will not be able to achieve anything with her. Not even sex, but the joyful company she gives you will disappear quickly.
Right.
But yes, assuming you're able to meet her expectations for gifts and other provision, she will give you sex and adoration and perhaps play into your love fantasy.
Hmm. Fantasy. Emphasis on the word fantasy.
Well, I think many of your viewers know that the idea men have of women is very idealized and does not really correspond to reality. And
Yeah, yeah,
no woman is unique in that regard.
yeah, and I think that's why so many men. Well, there are all these gradations of hues of pills, right? Purple pill, violet pill, right? Whatever.
Right?
And a lot of guys, especially in the United States, who just think, "Oh, American women are so terrible." I mean, I remember a time many, many eons ago when I was a younger man where I thought that, yeah, I mean, less so Eastern, but sort of Asian women, specifically East Asian women, like that was where you wanted to go because they were somehow different. And in time,
Ah,
I learned that they're not, having had experiences with them. And I think, if your only experience is, say, the American female, then it's easy to jump the gun and just assume that, oh, if I go over to Ukraine, I'll find a nice traditional woman who just wants to be loved and love me back as long as I support her. That, yeah, it's understandable why they think that. Also, because if you were to actually take a look at the landscape of the world in terms of divorce, relationship dysfunction, it's pretty bleak. Especially you look at places in Eastern Europe, the divorce rates are higher. It's a mess. You even have comparative divorce rates in places like the Middle East increasingly. So there, there aren't many lights at the end of the tunnel. So it makes sense that men would be taken in by the notion, oh, if I go here, if I go to Ukraine or Russia, I'll find a nice woman. When in reality, it's in fraught other obviously with other difficulties than one would be in the United States, but still nonetheless fraught with difficulties. Would you
yeah,
say,
certainly.
would you say, having grown up in Eastern Europe yourself, interacting with other females, that that element of intrasexual interaction behavior is somehow different from what you could observe in the West, say the way high school girls interact with each other, if that would be any different?
No, I think there is, from what I've observed, there is very little to no difference. And the difference really grows as they mature, in that Western European women, to their benefit, appear to be less mercantile, or at least less open about their demands to the men. I think Western European women have adopted a sense of pride in their in the idea of them being independent and capable of doing everything a man can. And though that blows in their face when they try to appear masculine in their appearance and behavior and turn off their suitors, they are they attempt to be more honest about their intention.
Hmm.
Of course, Eastern European women are similar to Western women. They're similarly catty. The nature of relationships between women is not inherently different. I think you could say that it's all very political. And while Western women talk about how feminist they've been that week, or how they've been offended by some misogynist on the bus, Eastern European women will talk about that guy who bought them flowers and who they're going to milk for all that he is worth and then move on to the next one.
Have you observed this type of behavior, seen women act in an explicitly mercantile fashion?
Oh, I have. It becomes more evident with age, and it doesn't even take alcohol for that to come about. With the expectation that man pays for the dates, it inevitably comes up that the man is expected to pay for everything, and the upkeep of her beautiful appearance is also part of what he must pay for.
Right.
And of course, there is gifts, there is vacations, and the demand for those rises the more rich the man appears to be.
But have you perhaps also observed, just sort of a Hollywood trope, but sort of women sipping margaritas together, talking about, plotting against their husbands, or trying to get him for every nickel and dime he has, or that sort of thing. The sort of discussions, open discussions about how much money this guy has and how they're gonna, I guess you could say, lodge their talons into the guy and take him for everything he's worth, or is that just too overt? Women.
No, uh, that's really one of the expressions of the not sexualization, but hyper masculinity and hyper femininity of the culture. An entry level for a man to become acquainted to a woman depends on the class, but generally it involves some sort of status. And working class women, so it may be physical prowess. Maybe he's a tough cookie who's been in several fights, and everybody's afraid to confront him. And middle and upper middle class, it's a man who earns well, who has a nice car, has an apartment, and perhaps he bought his mother an apartment too. And it's openly discussed, and it's part of the criteria that is used to find a partner.
Yeah.
And granted, it's not unique to Eastern Europe. Asian countries, particularly China,
I
are.
wanted to mention China actually.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of that famous video, "No car, no house"? You might have.
Yeah, no car, no house,
Yeah,
no wife, or something like that.
and then that channel, I believe, Asian Boss, that has by now a panoply of different Asian countries they're covering. The guy essentially rented. It wasn't even an escort. It sort of rented I guess, companion for the day, and just
Yeah.
completely open-minded, or rather open about what the money being the criteria and what have you. And honestly, I'm not I'm kind of retired from that business, so to speak. But if I were active in that, or even younger and active, I think that's a kind of it's refreshing almost, because what I think can be observed by Western women, as you somewhat alluded to, is that yeah, they'll pay, they'll go Dutch, they'll pay for it, but they don't want to, or they want to ostensibly want to be strong and independent, but at the same time they're not going to tolerate a man who's earning significantly less than they are. There is good evidence these days from divorce statistics, and I think Barbarossa most famously did a video on house husbands many moons ago, and why it's just not a good idea.
Yeah, how poorly they do.
Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, if anything, that's a refreshing attitude. It's not exactly pleasant. I'm sure you'd be confronted by that, but it's I'd rather, if I were on the market doing that sort of thing, I'd rather deal with that than I would some pretense and illusion hidden behind a masquerade that everyone seems to agree upon that we have to pretend here, but here's the reality. Um, you know,
Yeah, as you said, Western women like to pretend to be egalitarian, but at the end of the day, they want to be wined and dined and be a stay-at-home moms like every other woman on the planet, probably. And in case of China, it's I think the most blatant example of this sort of mercantile approach to dating and marriage.
hmm,
Uh, Parents in China tend to act as the gatekeepers for long-term relationships slash marriage, and their criteria, while the while the woman often dictates the ultimate criteria, she's influenced by her parents. And what parents demand is an ability not only support the woman herself and their potential children, but also the parents themselves,
hmm.
and perhaps buy them gifts such as cars. Of course, having an apartment and a decent car and a decent job is just the start of it all.
Right.
As a result, as you might expect, a lot of Chinese men are disenfranchised and are completely unable to participate in the dating market.
Well, the single child policy contributed to that as
Of
well.
course, yeah, I think
Dis-
the ratio of men to women is 1.6 to 2 or
Something like
some,
that.
yeah,
It's there's a huge disequilibrium there, which is obviously favoring the female part there because obviously they're going to have more suitors as a consequence, and there'll be more male competition and what have you. But I mean, a little bit of a transition on. You're a female, obviously. Well, one could hope.
maybe.
Maybe, yeah. Um, the your experience with female behavior, you seem to also largely agree that female behavior is universal, give or take certain things. Sure, behavior is mediated by the environment, but at the same time, the things we can universally observe in women. Would you say that's your view?
Yeah, I think so. It's the changes applied by the culture and the environment are pretty marginal, and they really come down to how explicit a woman is with her desires.
Hmm.
Okay, so a pretty Eastern European woman, she will openly tell you that she needs a car from you and an apartment from her for her mom. Whereas a Western woman will just hint at it. But ultimately, the innate behavior, the desires, and the ways they go about achieving those desires are the same, or at least very, very similar.
Hmm. What do you think about? I mean, I this is a difficult subject, obviously, but I mean, people talk about this all the time. Men love differently than women, what have you. But one thing I think you probably would agree on that women's quote unquote love is on a much shorter fuse typically. And I've often painted. I know you're somewhat familiar with my channel, so you've checked out
Right?
some of my material. I've often painted this as a kind of either a film that's in progress or maybe a picture, and then this pristine picture when it takes on qualities of reality, and maybe it's not as pretty a picture as the woman had conceived, and that image of love, you could also call it infatuation, but it tends to shatter quite quickly. Um, and I mean, I guess my question would be: Is it? Do you think it would be incorrect to assess female love as more transient and less stable than male love in light of this?
I think an important aspect of female psychology that's often underappreciated and understudied is their ability to compartmentalization. Uh, I think many are familiar with the idea of war brides, in that in prehistoric times, women of warring tribes would be captured after the battle has occurred, and then either be raped and bear children or die. And there is the result, women involved to accept their fate and accept the advances of men of other tribes as a survival mechanism. Now, whether that is the case or not is not for us to decide, but women Since women operate in a very abstract environment, in many times purely social environment, and that's where they derive their status. They are required to have a degree of emotional flexibility to do well and to be able to maintain their not just their sanity but their status. And I think yes, it is true that women's love is not it will not be eternal. It will not remain after you have broken up or she left you, and it may fizzle out very quickly if you refuse or are unable to meet her demands. But to say that it does not exist, I think, is an oversimplification. It does. Women are able to love the man they're with, and they're able to enjoy their company and care deeply about their well-being and be devastated when they're gone. But at the same time, they're able to move away from it quicker than men perhaps would. And a man may wear the scar of his crush for many, many years after it has passed, but a woman may forget about it entirely and may only be reminded when she's out drinking with her friends.
Yeah, I mean, the divorce results, I mean, I can't say the word on the channel, it's a banned word on YouTube, but checking out early, I think everyone knows what I mean by that. Men, the the comparison between men after divorce versus women is staggering. And people ascribe that to support networks or what have you, but a lot of men fall into despair and ultimately never recover. Some do, but it takes years and years. And of course, anecdotally, I can attest to this in former times in a different dimension when I was a different person. Observing ex-wives of mine, or girlfriends as they're more conventionally called, seemingly just recovering within a few months when it took me, a year or two in some cases, of sort of constantly masticating and chewing through the material of the former relationship. I think that's, obviously has something to do with evolution. Maybe war bride theory is correct, maybe it's not, but there's certainly something to it in just observing the way, in our time, women react as a consequence of that, and they just deal with it a lot better typically.
And really, it's not that it extends only to relationships between men and women. All relationships women experience, except perhaps relationships with their parents, are of such nature. I think the idea that female friends are female friendships are not as deep as male friendships hold true, and that is one of the reasons why. It is not simply that female relationships involve drama and often petty conflict that builds up over time and leads to a breakup of sorts, but also the fact that it's transient in in pretty much all aspects, and they're able to move on easily and may not even leave. It may not even leave a lasting mark on them.
Well, okay, then I'd have to ask the question if you're proposing that. I mean, we acknowledge that some form of quote unquote love. I mean, I don't like the term love for either men or women, but we'll use that, right? Is is expressed towards men, but in intrasexual relationships, assuming they're heterosexual, sort of the love of friendship, that you're proposing that that's just skin deep and also more transitional than the kind of more brotherly, fraternal friendships that exist intrasexually between heterosexual men. How would that manifest itself? I mean, it seems to me as it's a very different dynamic because there's a lot of projection involved on the part of women who are looking at men. Obviously, that's this. I do think
Right.
my picture or my painting metaphor is reasonably apt, and it would not be the case, I imagine, intrasexually with women. There's no projection necessarily, although you feel free in a second to correct me if I'm wrong, because the woman isn't looking to acquire the other woman as a mate, because she's, in this case, not a lesbian. But nonetheless, you are claiming that these relationships are more superficial. Now, anecdotally, I would support that, just because I've seen the flimsiness of so-called female friendships, I guess, topple over because a breeze blew a twig the wrong way, so to speak. Um, but yeah, I mean, maybe you could elaborate on what you mean in the intrasexual context.
Well, I think it is incorrect to say that women love superficial. They are able to love deeply, and I think it's been a discovery of the Red Pill community that women women can be greatly infatuated with a man and may obsess over him for decades to come. However, really, it is not the depth that is questionable, but the the mark that it leaves on them. Of course, if a woman is quote unquote alpha widowed, or she had problems with her father that left that will leave a lasting mark. But in general, relationships are something that's possible to move on from and to recover ultimately. And partially support networks are to thank for that. But also the fact that women, the way women bond, not just with other men, not just with men or other women, or and other women, but with everyone around them, is based on the idea of, I guess you describe it as grooming each other socially. When I think of female interactions, I always think of two monkeys picking out fleas out of each other's fur.
Oof. Okay.
And while it's not a pretty picture, I think it really serves as a good metaphor of how they interact. If a woman compliments your appearance on a certain day, someday you are expected to compliment her back, or it's a error on your part. Likewise, if you open up to your female friend about a difficult situation you're facing emotionally and she consoles you, you have to console her back. And it may vary in depth and the impact it has, but ultimately there is a back and forth that's going on that needs to be constantly reinforced, or else the relationship falls apart and may even turn hostile.
If I could just play devil's advocate briefly, or not even devil's advocate, but it seems quite reasonable to argue that all relationships, and especially friendship, male or female, is based upon reciprocity. The value of trust that you have in somebody is typically weighted by past experience and because of favors or services rendered, or simply just positive interactions. So I mean, contest this if you will, but reciprocity seems to be a universal. But I think what you're arguing is that with women, the nature of reciprocity has been automatized in some sense,
Uh,
almost
not,
reflexive.
not that it's, or not even that it's reflexive, though oftentimes it is, but it's certainly more frequent, and it has to be maintained at a higher rate than relationships, friendships between men. The reason being is that men are able to go for a beer once a week and still be friends after decades, whereas for women, um, ignoring a female friend for a week or two may result in her becoming your enemy or losing the friendship. I think the reason that is the case is to do with the fact that women are greatly socially oriented in both their vocations and their behavior as within a group. And so they're also more neurotic, and as a result, many of the social interactions that they have will have on the current of intrigue to them and some sort of second layer that may not be apparent to the eye, but is still present. And I guess you could say that that women maintain a multiple levels of interactions when they are together. So when you compliment a female friend on her dress, it may be to encourage her, and she really is expected to encourage you back in the future. Or it may be to subvert her ability to participate in the dating market. and make yourself stand out as the more attractive female of the group.
Hmm.
But whereas male relationships and relationships men attempt to have with women are reasonably straightforward and simple. You do you say what you're going to do, and you do it, and there is no undercurrent of undercurrent meaning behind it. And that I think really is the major reason for conflict between the sexes when they enter a relationship or when they are in a mixed gender group. Because men, not only men are less capable of reading social situations, they're less capable of reading faces. And as such, they're going to miss a lot of hints that women give them. That's often explored in the PUA community, but it applies to all social situations. And as a result of men being unable to play this hidden little game that women enjoy between each other, there's a gap, uh, perhaps a valley that can never be truly bridged.
So you're saying essentially that one of the sources of conflict, either in mixed groups or between men and women, is simply predicated on, yeah, I mean, the studies suggest that the women are better at reading faces and interpreting social cues. Um, I suppose saying that men are somewhat less adept at it. That's one way of looking. Of course, you could also argue that men are just more sincere and straightforward. They just help you out. Whether you look look at them a certain way or not is not terribly relevant. I suppose I don't want to use the term simplistic, but there's a more straightforward relationship, whether it's intrasexually, and I guess I hope this isn't too far afield, but when you look at relationship dysfunction in general or marital dysfunction, oftentimes when it's even at a late stage, and by that I mean the woman is seriously considering breaking up or divorce, the man isn't clued in at all because there's a whole world going on in the woman's head that the man is not picking up on.
Yeah,
He
he's
thinks
not really
everything,
aware of.
yeah, he's going to work, everything's fine, and then all of a sudden, boom, sorry, Jack, but I want a divorce. And he's just sitting there and his jaw drops because he's like, wait, everything was fine for the past 5 years, wasn't it?
And he's devastated. Yes,
Yeah.
that is that is a scenario that's often presented. And of course, then the wife will give a reason why she's done it, and it may come down to she feels unhappy, or she feels neglected, or she feels like she's not getting what she deserves out of the relationship. Or she may drop the hints of that, but men, not only are they not uh, have more difficulty picking up on that, they also may be too tired from working a full-time job, while their wife stays home with the kids.
Hmm.
Really, I think it comes down to our evolution as a sexually dimorphic species, and how how the danger presented itself into each sex. Now, if we assume the hunter-gatherer theory is correct, then the man's greatest source of danger is a predator. It's the nature itself and the inability to enter nature and return victorious with food or with some sort of gift for the tribe that would help him maintain his social status. Now, while women, by that theory, were expected to similarly go out and collect roots and herbs and other seasonal vegetables or perhaps small animals, their biggest source of danger was not a predator necessarily, unless a predator attacked a village, but the tribe itself, or rather being ostracized from the tribe. It could be said that that is the reason why women on average are more neurotic, because an inability to pick up on the fact that your tribe does not like you is going to be fatal to you. But it also makes them more invested in their social standing, as well as the fact that they need to be extremely they need to always be on the lookout for signs and cues of that they're not liked. And similarly, they give out this as members of the tribe. They would give out these cues themselves that men, by virtue being so so different, are unable to pick up on.
Well, yeah, and in some way, the men, I would largely subscribe to that idea or that theory myself, because, I mean, you can see this in the real world. Men are typically more self sufficient than women are. This must have been the case in the ancestral environment, too. Not to say it was, if you were a man stranded alone, it was an easy thing, but by dint of, different physiology, and in some cases, better performance, it'd be easier. I would subscribe to that, certainly, but it's also it's simpler with men in general. Now, there's more clarity as a consequence of that. It's just easier, who a good friend is by his deeds. Reinforcement, I think, is universal. You don't need constant reinforcement, and I think you're largely right that picking up on cues just never. I mean, I have a few friends who, they, I have a good friend who's, I mean, emotionally, socially, I mean, he's not highly skilled at that sort of thing. Not that I care, but I value him a great deal nonetheless, and he's been very helpful to me and a reliable guy. And I would wonder sometimes if that type of relationship would even be possible between two women, where the woman, for whatever reason, maybe she's autistic, but has some sort of social dysfunction or can't pick up on cues, but she's basically a good person. But nonetheless, I wonder if that's possible. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's very likely. The masculinization of women and similar feminization of men is not exactly uncommon, and it is often suggested that autism in men is hypermasculinization of the brain. It similarly, that may be the case in women. So let's call her an autistic female may be able to maintain social status just by virtue of not breaking any overt rules, but she will be unable to pick up on the second layer or third layer or fourth layer of the social interactions that she encounters. And as a result, she would not be able to make friendships with other women easily, and perhaps even men, because she tries to interact honestly with them and is not able to does not comprehend exactly what their reaction is to her. Of course, men have it to the extreme. Autistic men,
Right,
or men with similar developmental problems,
right.
but women suffer from that too. I think when it comes to socialization, it is possible for women to have deep friendships, and it does not have to involve two hyper-masculinized females for that to be the case. But it is more difficult and does require a lot more upkeep. I would imagine you and your friend do not speak more than 3 times a week, maybe.
Yeah, something like that.
You don't
And we only see
constantly.
each other a couple times a year because he lives in a different country. So,
Exactly. And
you know.
I mean, in for other men, they may meet with their friends more often and may go out with them often, but they're not expected to be there all the time. And that really seems to be the basis for a lot of female relationships. This ability to support and hug and help on demand.
Yeah, I'd like to try to link this to something, because we're spending a lot of time talking about women's greater ability to pick up on social cues. But then there's an aspect of self awareness, which I think you might agree, on average, women typically display less self awareness and the same sort of self reflection, metacognition, if you want to call it that, than men do. And I say that because oftentimes women will, in their behavior, kind of they think that there's something there, but that reality is not adjoined to the reality of everyone in the room, so to speak, or their partner or whatever. It's they. I mean, you kind of touched on this briefly in the sense that they always think about how they sort of fit in socially. They're more neurotic, But oftentimes it seems that they create entire realities for themselves that really don't map onto the common shared reality above all of their quote unquote male partners and just anyone who's around. And that is strange and it seems almost paradoxical because on the one hand, better social cues, better reading facial expressions, etc., simultaneously not having a good self-awareness, not being tied into reality. And I'd argue that assuming the ancestral hypothesis, yeah, men would have to be because the dangers were in reality, landslides, saber-toothed cats, take your pick,
Right.
that I've witnessed in my own life and previous incarnations where I pursued relationships and other men, tons of other men. Men are got embroiled in conflicts when they didn't know there was a conflict, and the things that women are talking about don't map onto the reality of the man as he knows it, which typically I have to say is the more accurate picture of reality. So it's almost like chimeras or phantasms in the woman's mind. And then later on, they might concede some error, maybe. But oftentimes, there's just a sort of after-the-fact justification there. I'm curious what your thoughts on that might be.
I think this wonderful ability to read covert social cues and neuroticism together create a possibility for a woman to see things that aren't simply there. So if we take an example of a boyfriend and a girlfriend were walking down the street, and a beautiful female, much more attractive than the girlfriend herself, passes them by, and a boyfriend briefly looks at her, and the girlfriend sees this, and she's dismayed, and she's upset and hurt, and perhaps she suspects that he may be cheating on her, that he doesn't find her attractive, so he's not going to be faithful, or he isn't faithful already. And if a woman is neurotic enough, it may escalate into a conflict, and it would create an assumption that the man is already cheating for the simple fact that he was caught staring at another woman, even for a brief moment. What women don't realize is that it may just be a coincidence, and it's something. Well, it may be on their part. It would have been deliberate and a display of their dissatisfaction at something, looking at, let's say, on a very attractive man while they're out with their boyfriend.
Mm-hmm.
The man would not even notice that more often than that, as you said, with the divorce being sprung up on men so often.
Mm-hmm.
So this creates yes, you're right, a parallel reality where the woman thinks she's been slighted and thinks that her position in the relationship and the man's concern for her and the investment in her is not as deep as she had hoped, and that puts her in a confrontational position. And that's something I can attest to. It is not being overwhelmed by emotion per se. It is simply a certainty. It seems that you have been slighted, that there is a conspiracy against you that is slowly being implemented by you thought faithful husband, but actually a horrible cheater. That he's going to leave you, and he doesn't really like you.
And you've personally experienced this?
Oh, I have. Unfortunately, I have. Now, thankfully, I was able to recognize shortly after that wasn't the case, but
can you I have to pry your mind about this. So you've experienced this, you could say, warping of reality, as you put it, parallel reality. Very good way of putting it, mind you. And then at some point in time, maybe an hour, maybe a day later, you come to your senses. What is that transition like? Is it like you're saying to yourself, I could have sworn I was seeing purple were-owls. The purple were-owls were there. And then all of a sudden there are no purple were-owls there anymore, and you're just thinking, what the hell? I mean, what is the transition like? What does it feel like, essentially, in your own mind to be the receiving end of what of what was basically an illusion that was so convincing that you had to run with it? I imagine in former, in your relationships, I don't know what your status is, but you used to essentially attack your partner for that reason, right?
Yeah, I have a number of partners, and my behavior has been varied from, I would say, horrid to acceptable over the years as I've grown older. Really, it is. I would not say that I was insufferable, but yeah, I have given my previous partners a lot of hardship that they did not ultimately deserve.
Mm.
Now, I would say the transition is really it is not like snapping out of a trance, or it is not becoming a beast and transforming into a human again. It is simply a, s- a switch from understanding that one reality is true to realizing that what you thought was true is not true at all and was simply a product of your imagination. And while I said it's not beast transformation, it can be likened to a werewolf, to
Yeah.
being a werewolf. And part of the reason is that it ties into women's natural cycle, hormonal cycle. Now, at the time of ovulation, women are more likely to perceive social advances towards them as sexual, and also perceive the advances of their boyfriend towards other women as sexual, and that may cause a conflict. On the other hand, during the end of their cycle, they would be seeking out comfort, and such an ability to meet their cues for comfort will be met with a fear that they're no longer desired,
But
which creates a different type of conflict.
the puzzling thing to me here is that whether it's you or other women, well, you seem to be somewhat more aware than a typical female about this. So this lycanthropy, this werebeast, as you put it. Um, I mean, to say it's a huge turnoff to a man, and I've experienced this in the past in previous marriages or relationships, as they're more commonly called. The, and especially in an acute case of a borderline personality disorder, a female that I was together with, where it's, you can almost say the epitome of the mercurial. 1 second it's one way, the next second you think it's a completely different person. That type of behavior can also often be interpreted as cruelty, certainly very unfair, and if anything, it ultimately pushes the female away from the male. In fact, one of my previous relationships, I don't think she was really a bad person, but ultimately I had to just it was just too much, and I had to just leave it behind because it happened too frequently. There was not enough self correction or improvement, and yeah, it just the juice wasn't worth the squeeze. Essentially, because I was dealing with these lycanthropic transformations far too often, and then yeah, there were apologies and realizations and acknowledgement of error, but it seemed that they were nonetheless inevitable. I don't know if you want to call these shit tests, as some people call them, but
I
these,
think
you know,
I think there are shit tests. What men very commonly refers to shit tests is the behavior a woman shows when you're out trying to pick up one,
hmm,
and it's considered something a test to gauge your interest in her. And that is certainly one aspect of dating that is true. However, in relationships, so-called shit tests are not really there to not simply there to gauge your interest, but they're also a way of test or establish dominance on the woman's part. So a conflict over, for example, a misunderstanding or a difference of opinion on a political subject one day may just end up in both of you saying we agree to disagree. On more unfortunate day may end up in her attacking you and saying that you don't care about her, or that you are wasting her time, or that you're a horrible person.
hmm,
And the dominance aspects, well, the answer to shit tests commonly given is to subvert them. However, that only applies in the dating world. And in the relationship, they have to be subverted, but in a way that reestablishes your dominance in the relationship. uh, which I think ultimately there is a certain power imbalance in relationships that is maintained by either the man or the woman. But you also have to answer the demand that the woman indirectly gives you. So if she's accusing you of cheating or about to cheat, then the demand is really to say that she's hot and you like having sex with her, and you want to continue her to continue being your girlfriend.
Mm.
Whereas in politics, in case of a political disagreement, you would say that ultimately it does not matter, and that she's more important than the disagreement itself.
Yeah.
So there is I think a degree of insecurity that is exposed here, and bipolar women are, I think, the most egregious example of that, because psychologically they have insecure attachment styles, which is very well documented, and as a result they have extreme difficulty trusting people and have difficulty forming relationships, and any relationships they do form they constantly doubt.
Mm.
The reason being is that they have not had much of an experience in childhood of being in a relationship where they could depend on the other person.
So you're saying basically broken family leads to the inability to long-term, I guess, secure or
Yeah.
maintain, because the reliability factor was never there. Logically, I mean, I've talked to you've heard of Wandering Wojak, maybe.
Yes, I have.
Yeah,
Great channel, by the way.
yeah, I think so too. Where it makes sense just logically that if your entire life you've been in a unstable situation, couldn't rely on your kin, which are typically the people you're supposed to rely on most, friends or what have you, that later down the line throughout your life you're going to be really suspicious. You're going to be checking behind to see if someone's there or not, and your ability to quote unquote trust somebody and to think that maybe that person's okay is severely diminished. And
Yes, and often it's expressed in the term daddy issues,
yeah,
because the most common, the most obvious example of that is a woman who was raised in a family without a stable father
mm,
figure. But it does not necessarily mean that a woman without a father is going to be completely dysfunctional and borderline have borderline personality disorder and be a danger to herself and people around her. But it will mean that yes, she will be more concerned about the stability of her relationships. She'll be more not just intersexual relationship, but the relationships with everyone, really.
and certainly more neurotic too,
Oh,
typically.
for sure. For,
Yeah,
that seems to go hand in hand with lack of trust, this high neuroticism.
yeah, understandable, especially in an ancestral environment where things were dangerous
Of
and
course.
cautious. But I'm, you know, I'm increasingly coming to the conclusion that in the modern 2019 environment, high neuroticism is largely not of huge benefit. I mean, it can be in some cases. So let's say you came down, you're diagnosed with some severe case of cancer. If you're really not neurotic, it might deprive you of sleep and all sorts of things. But you might try to take care of it as best as you can. With someone who's more laid back, I don't want to drift off topic too much, but it just seems that high neuroticism is not of tremendous benefit. Certainly not in a relationship where it seems that highly neurotic women would just, well, it's been my experience with some, test the man more often than not. And as I got older, I realized that the best way of dealing with some of these lycanthropic transformations, probably attributable to neurosis, was just at least temporarily walk away, and in one or two cases permanently. We say, look, I'm just disengage, walk away, and maybe the person will come to their senses. But what you described earlier, this seeming epiphany that in your own case, in your previous relationships, where you realize you're essentially acting horribly to your former partner, I never really had that experience. It was sort of the women in question. They didn't really acknowledge wrongdoing or really just that anything was. They just were back to quote unquote normal, but there was no acknowledgement that anything went awry. It was just this, you know, almost a seamless transition from lycanthropy to human, and it was very strange. Why do you think, in this case, you're actually aware of this transition, whereas in my observation and observing other men in their relationships and with women, women are just not aware of this at all?
I think there are several reasons for that. One being is that I was not socialized as a female necessarily. Well, my mother was, I guess you could say, was a traditional Eastern European woman who dressed well and wore makeup every day. I was not given any expectations of that sort, and I am likely masculinized to some degree. I guess, well, at least the length of my fingers can attest to that. Ring finger and the pointing finger, by the way, for those interested. It predicts the ratio of masculinization, both men and women. And really, it comes down to the fact that I was able to observe women from not only I had difficulty engaging with other women on a social level. I was left no choice but to observe them from afar. And what I would find in them and later find in myself is that they're ego-driven. Now, all people are to some extent, but women even more so, and as well as the fact that women are more capable of rationalization. I think everyone can attest to that with the infamous rationalization hamster growing fatter and fatter in every woman's brain year by year.
Hmm.
And really, it's the combination of both those factors that make it difficult for any woman to acknowledge that she's done something wrong. Not that it never happens, but it is something that is genuinely difficult to achieve. And the ability to rationalize every wrongdoing on your part as something justified, something that is the fault of the other party, makes it, well, more often than that, impossible. I think the only time where women can acknowledge that they're in the wrong is when they're uh, not a very savory topic, but when they're on their period,
Hmm.
because it is often said women are often accused of having PMS, that they're extremely emotional when they're on their period, and women have no choice but to acknowledge that and to try to apologize for that and to try to cope with that. What
Okay. It's,
what many of them do not realize is that this is not the only time in their cycle when this change occurs. Truly, the female behavior, mine included, can be tracked to a great degree by the stage of their hormonal cycle.
hmm.
As I said earlier, you can predict when a woman is going to be the most attentive to intersexual competition and the attention of other men. So the time when she's going to be the most insecure about her position. And the end of the cycle and consequently pregnancy are the time when the woman is the most insecure about herself.
See,
But
no, just a little interjection. I mean, yeah, women might acknowledge that, but when they're doing the PMS thing, but typically they'll say that they expect complete understanding, and no matter how outrageous the behavior is, you're just supposed to accept it because, well, it's just
yeah,
a
it's
natural
also
thing. Yeah.
the case with pregnant women. They're given a great amount of leeway for oftentimes completely unacceptable behavior,
Hmm.
which sometimes can be explained by hormones, and they describe themselves and are described as deeply hormonal.
Yeah.
But really, it is this the idea that women's hormones make them make them temporarily insane, but they're still rational agents. That
Hmm.
is perhaps problematic. Well, to call it insanity is an exaggeration, but this severe change in perception and behavior makes it difficult for other people to maintain a relationship with them. As you said in your own interactions, so-called shit tests, ruining your perception of the woman you were with.
Yeah, if they were indeed, it was just, I sometimes call it Jekyll or Hyde, or yeah, lycanthropy, however you want to put it. Um, yeah, you reach the point where you just don't want to deal with that anymore. Um, Sometimes, you can, where that type of behavior is an inevitability, and you just want to walk away from it, which ultimately is what I did. And if I were presented with a similar situation, I'd be much more likely these days to just not tolerate anything of that sort and just walk away. Just because I'm very familiar with it, I've dealt with it, and my tolerance threshold for BS on the part of women is pretty minimal. But you mentioned just before the sort of ever growing rationalization hamster and how it's getting fatter and fatter. Where do you see things going between men and women in the West and Eastern Europe more broadly? But just it doesn't seem like things are really improving. And I know you're somewhat keyed into, I guess, various manosphere news currents. You're familiar with the FA or the incel phenomenon,
Right?
where, and I think you've heard of Monday. I've had him on
Yeah,
recently.
very, very good content.
Pretty base dude, where he's pointed out that something like 30% of American males are just completely alone, no sex, no partner. Where you know involuntarily, I guess for the most part, this isn't some epiphany they had after a bunch of relationships, like is often the case with MGTOW. That long term, this is just not sustainable because of the level of dysfunction it's going to lead to, even in the pragmatic sense. So let's say it increases to 50%. I mean, typically when that happens, men go into survival mode. Well, maybe they'll work some shitty job to get by. That's not going to generate a lot of tax revenue, and men are the biggest taxpayers. Certainly compared to women, they generate most tax revenue. And I mean, it's hard for me to be. It's black pilled, yeah, but it's hard for me to be optimistic about any scenario, especially for men who really, for whatever reason, I guess just instinct, they really want families, they want to reproduce, they want the dream. When that dream is becoming increasingly untenable, and some not so insignificant percentage of men are going to have to say, "Look, I might want this, but this is not feasible. There's no way I can achieve this because of all the obstacles." When you look at the landscape between men and women right now, what do you see?
I think the study Monday was referring to is something that came out recently, I think within the last few months, that measured that around half of the US population between the ages of 20 to 35, if I'm not mistaken, is currently single.
Hmm.
Men make a large proportion of that. I think it is indicative of the problems the society is facing, not necessarily the onslaught of feminism and the identity politics into the common culture, but really the fact that increasingly it's becoming more difficult for men to create, achieve, and maintain their status. Having a job is no longer sufficient when most of the women are college educated and may earn even more than the men. Having a college education is not sufficient because more and more women have PhDs, and so it's a constant race to try and find a threshold at which they can find a partner and settle down and have children. But due to a variety of factors, women's participation in universities included, it's becoming more difficult. And really, I think the socioeconomic status of many of these men is to blame.
Hmm.
In the sense that the job market in the United States, despite having a higher participation rate, is looking very grim, as I think you've discussed recently. And men are, as the gender that has a smaller support network and less compassion given towards them, is hit the hardest by it. Combine that with increased globalization and the economy becoming geared towards consumption, mass production, of course, China being the biggest example of that. Men are simply not given an opportunity to excel at something, or they are unable to.
Yeah, and I also think that it's one of those things that the powers that be will never, how should I put it, want to just come forward with and just be square with these guys. Hey, look, some of you guys just aren't going to make it. I mean, that's not a positive message. But
I mean, to be frank, I think society at large is very aware and very fearful of the of incels, I guess you could call them, with the recent incidents coming to mind in Canada.
Yeah,
and
well,
even
let's not
earlier
get too
with
graphic about that, but sure.
no, of course not.
Yeah.
And even earlier in other countries. But really, this concern is an expression. It does not truly lead to any sort of solution, nor it will, because the only solution that can work, as you may have discussed earlier, is the men have to be helped to achieve some sort of status in society. They have to be given an opportunity by the opposite sex to prove themselves that they're a capable partner. And that requires sacrifice on the part of the society that never really cared about men at all, and sacrifice from women who may have to settle down with a partner that earns less than them, that is comparably less attractive than them, well, significantly less attractive, who is not as ambitious as they would have hoped.
Well,
and they often propagate ideas that women want a Chad who earns 6 figures and is 6 foot tall, and that is certainly the true, but the reality really is that women would not, even the more reasonable women would not settle for someone shorter than them, even if they didn't want Christian Grey from a certain book to be their future husband.
The exception there being, I've noticed that excessively tall women, I guess for Americans who are 6 feet or taller, oddly enough, I've observed this over the last couple of years, are in a weird position because their mating market choices seem to be quite limited. In some cases, they're willing to, how should I put it, date down, date height down, in the sense that they're actually taller than the men they date. Because imagine if you're 6'1" or 2" as a female. I mean, you already want a taller guy. It's a lot harder to find a taller guy when you're that tall than when you're 5'5" or 5'4".
And also, tall men tend to want women that are noticeably shorter than them.
Yes.
It is whereas, short women of all heights prefer men over 6 foot tall, as often shown on Tinder and other dating websites.
Yeah.
And I think the reason why tall women are less fortunate, are less picky in that regard, is that they're ultimately viewed as less attractive. Even if they have a 9 out of 10 face and a body that would make any of their girlfriends jealous, the fact that they're taller just
is height is not neotenous.
Height is not neotenous, exactly, even if their face perfectly is. And that is a turn off for a lot of men.
Whereas if you're 5'4" and really cute and you have all the other features, I mean, there's going to be a queue forming up behind you as female at least, and
you don't even have to be cute. You just have to be reasonably attractive. And in the US, that means not being fat, and you're able to get a boyfriend of any height you desire.
Yeah. That's a funny point. As long as you're, because the obesity epidemic is part of the whole sexlessness thing, but I mean, it's all, I've talked about this with Monday, that social dysfunction has a huge role to play in the obesity epidemic. The food is the means, but the end is to try to satiate something else. But that goes beyond the scope of our discussion. So I guess you would go on.
True, but women are more prone to obesity, really, for a variety of due to a variety of factors. One Some of them might be social, perhaps, and have to do with the dysfunction of their upbringing. However,
Mm.
women are, I think, have a greater response to sweets, and enjoy sweets more than men, and they have a more sensitive palate, which allows them to enjoy food at a slightly higher level than men. Perhaps combine that with lower self-control and lower conscientiousness, then it's very easy to become overweight, especially in a society in a country where carbs and sugars are easily available.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, that, again, beyond the scope, but that is interesting. Obviously, an evolved feature, uh, women's, I guess, better sense of taste. I've read things about that. But all in all, you'd agree that it's an increasingly grim picture. And I would want, as a final point I'd make, is that although men do cooperate with each other to achieve goals, in the sexual market, if you're an 8.5 or a 9, what is your interest in trying to help out some of the guys? No, you just rather have as many options available as possible from a reproductive perspective. I mean, although I know I've heard some arguments to counter that, perhaps, but in the modern sense, right now in the modern society we live in, it seems to me that that sort of cooperation would not be really beneficial when you can have the pick of the litter, so to speak, of women who are all looking upwards because of hypergamy and what have you. So I think it will get worse and worse, and I don't think we're going to have I guess, an honest, I don't want to say confrontation, but in fact, only the German word occurs to me. Auseinandersetzung. An honest dealing with this problem, so to speak,
Right.
because of that. So yeah.
I certainly think that, and that we can go back to the idea of Eastern European women being more traditional.
Mm.
Often suggested solution to the problem is to return to the cultural values that the country in question, for example, the United States, had prior to popularization of feminism or more egalitarian society. However, I don't think ultimately that may occur.
Mm.
For the reason being is that society being so atomized and growing more so each year may not have any meaningful family values to speak of in 50 years' time, much less those that gear towards monogamy and pairing of men.
Yeah.
I think really what lies in the future of many men is ideally a realization that they're capable individuals, that they're valid individuals without the company of a woman. That what the company of a woman may give them will not be what they expected, even if
Right.
it's a perfect, seeming attractive traditional girl. And MGTOW may be one way of doing that. Another may just be finding something that interests you, and maybe one day you may encounter a woman who wants to spend time with you, maybe not. But if you hope to find a woman one day, that is very unlikely to happen.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. Well, it's getting late over here, so it might be time to wrap it up. But I hope this was a bit different than it usually is. I mean, typically I don't talk to females, but I guess you're pretty red-pilled on these matters. So I want to thank you for your time and your contribution. And to the audience, I will check you out later if I'm still alive. And as always, may the gods watch over you. Thanks again for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Okay. If you liked this video, please like, share, and subscribe. And if you enjoy my content, please consider making a donation or becoming a patron. Thanks for watching.